The Atlantic winds howled against the jagged cliffs of Saint Helena, that lonely outpost in the middle of the ocean where exiles and secrets were sent to die. For Lieutenant Jonathan Ellis of the 20th Regiment, the desolation suited him. After all, what better place to bury disappointment than at the farthest edge of the empire? It was 1821 when he arrived, the same year death loomed over Longwood House. Assigned as a junior officer in the British garrison guarding the former Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, Ellis had expected boredom, dusty routines, ocean mist, and the dull chatter of men with too much time. But the island proved otherwise. Ellis was a meticulous man, shaped by years of routine and regulation. He recorded everything: weather patterns, troop drills, the daily shipments of supplies. And it was during one of his first inspections of the quartermaster's logs that he noticed a discrepancy. Nothing grand, just a single entry dated the previous month, listing a crate marked M delivered directly to Longwood. There was no such record in the corresponding inventory from the dock. The officer responsible for dockside logs, a portly sergeant named Blythe, shrugged. "Could have been a misentry," he said. "Happens more than you think." But Ellis didn't think it happened often at all. The British watched Napoleon with the paranoia of an empire afraid of ghosts. Every visitor was scrutinized, every shipment documented. An unexplained crate didn't fit that pattern. Longwood itself sat brooding on the highland plateau, exposed to the winds. The house was decaying, its shutters battered, the roof sagging under age and damp. Ellis visited as part of his new rotation, posted temporarily to observe and report on the French staff attending the former emperor. It was then that he first met Dr. Barry O'Mara's replacement, Drive. Francesco Antomarchi. The Corsican physician was polite but evasive, slipping between French and Italian with the ease of a man who never stayed in one place for long. Napoleon was indisposed, he explained. Stomach ailments, perhaps worse. His tone held a trace of something else, worry or calculation. The ex-emperor's health had been a topic of whispered speculation for months. Some said cancer, others poison. But Ellis was not interested in rumors. He wanted facts. He began keeping a second journal, hidden beneath a false bottom in his trunk. In it, he noted strange occurrences. A French servant dismissed suddenly. An English gardener who refused to speak of a quarrel he'd witnessed at the rear of Longwood. A sealed letter sent to London with no return mark, just the initials, R.C., scrawled across the fold. He had no authority to investigate, but he asked questions all the same. Too many, perhaps. One evening, as fog rolled in from the sea, Ellis returned to his quarters to find his belongings disturbed. Not stolen, rearranged. His journal had been placed exactly where he left it, but the ink on the last page bled slightly, as if a hand had pressed it down before it dried. The message was clear. Someone knew he was watching. Then came the day Napoleon died. May 5, 1821. The sky was uncharacteristically calm, the ocean like glass. Word spread quickly through the garrison. Some wept, others drank, a few cheered quietly. The great lion was dead, and the world would shift once more. Ellis was ordered to attend the post-mortem. The physician allowed only a few British officers to observe. What struck Ellis most wasn't the body, it was the silence of the French staff. Their eyes didn't mourn, they watched each other, not the corpse. They seemed expectant. That night, the winds returned. And with them came a whisper, carried through the stones of Longwood and down the cliffs to the sea. Ellis couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the pale face, the hands folded too perfectly. The room too clean. He opened his journal and wrote only one sentence: "Is the man in that coffin really Bonaparte?" The days following Napoleon's death passed in a haze of ceremonial formality. A funeral was arranged with awkward haste, and an open casket was permitted to confirm identity, though only to a select group. Ellis was not among them. That honor was reserved for those with political weight or long-standing association. The Marquis de Montholon, General Bertrand, and a few officers the French deemed trustworthy. Ellis watched from the perimeter as the casket was closed, the lid sealed with wax and iron. A few mourners cried, most simply watched, stone-faced. He observed Montholon, ever composed, whisper something in Bertrand's ear. Bertrand nodded once, barely perceptible. There was no visible grief. As the coffin was lowered into the shallow tomb near Geranium Valley, Ellis felt the ground shift, not physically, but historically. Something was off. The ritual had concluded, but the questions remained buried deeper than any coffin. He began to retrace events. Conversations. Timetables. He returned to the log of that mysterious crate and found another oddity. A French ship had arrived 2 weeks before Napoleon's death, far ahead of schedule and under partial disguise. It was listed as La Silencieuse, a private merchant vessel. The name struck him, the Silent One. Blythe, the port sergeant, claimed it had offloaded only supplies, wine, medical provisions, books. Nothing strange, he said. But Ellis learned that one crate had been taken inland immediately, with an armed escort, at Montholon's request. He pressed harder, this time turning to a local, Sarah Bickham, daughter of the innkeeper at Jamestown. Her brother had served as a temporary porter for the French, carrying items from the ship up the slopes to Longwood. After enough persuasion, and coin, she agreed to ask him what he remembered. He sent word 2 days later. There was a man in one of the crates. That single sentence shattered Ellis's understanding. He pressed for more, and Sarah returned with her brother's full account. A tall crate, heavier than expected, sealed in metal bands. The porters were told it contained delicate instruments. But one had heard breathing. Another, something shifting inside. They were threatened afterward, told never to speak of what they'd seen. Ellis's journal grew dense with speculation. Was this an impersonation? A last-ditch escape? Or something else entirely, something crafted by both the French and the British? He reread the official autopsy reports, which listed stomach cancer as the cause of death. But O'Meara, Napoleon's earlier physician, dismissed years before, had always suspected poisoning. Ellis obtained a copy of O'Meara's early letters, now stored in the island's administrative archives, and noticed one peculiar phrase repeated across several pages: too much antimony. No doubt. Antimony, used in small doses as medicine, but in larger amounts, a slow, undetectable killer. The idea that Napoleon had been poisoned was not new. But if the man who died was not Napoleon, then who had died in his place? The more he investigated, the more he felt watched. One night, while returning from the archives, Ellis noticed a figure trailing him through the narrow lanes of Jamestown. He stopped. The figure stopped. When Ellis turned to confront him, the street was empty, but a note had been slipped into his coat. Ask nothing further. The Emperor sleeps where he must. He burned the note. Not out of fear, but out of instinct. Too many threads were fraying at once. A week later, Ellis received an unexpected visitor. Captain Andrew Wellesley, a distant cousin of the Duke of Wellington, recently arrived under orders from the Admiralty. Wellesley was pleasant but curious, asking specific questions about Ellis's logs, his interactions with the French staff, and whether Ellis believed the autopsy was complete. Ellis lied. He said he trusted the report. Wellesley nodded slowly, then offered him a glass of Madeira. Good, because any alternate narrative would be problematic. The Empire needs certainty, not specters. They drank in silence. Ellis knew then that his search was dangerous and worse, possibly unwelcome by his own countrymen. But he was no longer following a curiosity. He was uncovering a conspiracy with international implications. He needed proof, and proof, he realized, might lie with the only man who had seen the corpse fully and lived to speak freely, the French valet, Louis Marchand. He made plans to visit Longwood again under the pretense of collecting uniforms for inventory. But someone had gotten there first. Marchand was gone. Ellis stood at the edge of the empty servants' quarters, the faint scent of wax and soap still lingering. Louis Marchand, Napoleon's trusted valet, had vanished overnight. No witness, no note, no suggestion of departure. The French staff claimed he had left for France on the merchant vessel La Belle Aimée, a ship Ellis knew had never docked. He filed an official inquiry. The reply was immediate, curt. Marchand departed under orders from the French government. No further information available, sealed with a British military stamp. The silence wasn't ignorance, it was enforcement. Ellis began to feel the island closing around him. Once distant hills now loomed. Men he had spoken with casually now watched him too closely. Even the chirping of birds at dawn felt deliberate, mechanical. It was the silence of a place where truth had been murdered. He turned to the only thing left, Longwood's dead corners. The house had been partially vacated after Napoleon's death. Ellis, using his rank, requested an inspection of the premises to ensure no contraband remained. A hollow excuse, but one that gave him access. The once vibrant residence was now a husk. Wallpaper peeled like drying parchment. Chairs covered in white cloth stood like ghosts. But Ellis was looking for something specific. A study Napoleon had used rarely, off a hallway, behind the library. Bertrand had once mentioned it, offhandedly. He found the door locked, the keyhole rusted. Instead of forcing it, he waited. That night, while the wind clawed at the shutters, he returned with a thin file and patience. After 15 minutes, the lock gave with a tired sigh. Inside, the air was still. A desk stood under a curtainless window. Nothing else. He opened the drawers. The top held only blank paper. The second, a broken quill and an empty inkwell. But the third refused to move. It was wedged shut, or sealed from within. He examined the wood. The desk was French, older than the others in the house, and bore a faded emblem, Bonaparte's personal sigil. Using the edge of his knife, he pried at the drawer's base until something clicked. It popped loose an inch. Inside, wrapped in thin oilcloth, lay a sheaf of pages bound by a red ribbon. They were in French, heavily coded, but some words bled through: doublure, double, le miroir, the mirror, and repeatedly, the name, Eugene. Eugene de Beauharnais, Napoleon's stepson. But he had died years earlier, hadn't he? Ellis took the pages and copied them that night, writing quickly by candlelight. By dawn, he had hidden the originals in a hollow behind his trunk lining. He carried the copies into Jamestown and sent them with a trusted courier to a contact in London, a former instructor at Sandhurst with an interest in ciphers. He told no one. But someone had noticed. When he returned from town, his quarters were overturned. Not ransacked, searched. Precisely. Every book opened, every drawer gently disturbed. His journal, his trunk, untouched but clearly studied. And at the center of his desk, placed like an accusation, lay a single white glove. French silk, Napoleon's style. Ellis's breath slowed. This wasn't intimidation anymore, it was a message, we know. That night, he left the garrison and walked alone to Napoleon's tomb in Geranium Valley. It was unguarded, the stone slab sealed tight, the air humid and heavy with the scent of wet grass. He stood there for hours, staring, until a whisper broke the silence. "You seek the wrong grave." Ellis spun. A figure stepped from the shadows, an old man, hunched, with a gardener's cap pulled low. He carried a rusted trowel and smelled of earth and mildew. Ellis recognized him, one of the part-time workers at Longwood, a mute, by reputation. But here he was, speaking with perfect clarity. "They buried a body," the man said, "but not the emperor's." "Where is he?" Ellis asked. The man just smiled and walked away, vanishing into the mist before Ellis could follow. Ellis returned to his quarters, soaked in sweat and seawind, his pulse ragged. In the days that followed, he was removed from his Longwood duties. Reassigned, a polite dismissal. But he still had the letters, and a theory. A replacement, a staged death, a smuggled escape. He just needed the final piece. And it came in the form of an unexpected letter from London, 2 months later. Marked by his instructor's hand, it read. Le Miroir was a code name. It referred not to a person, but to a scheme. A reflection, a body double. You were right, Jonathan. There was a substitution, and the clues lie not in the tomb, but in the departure logs from Spain. Spain. not France, not Saint Helena. Napoleon may have escaped east, not north. Ellis packed his journals and resigned his post. He booked passage on the next vessel out. But before he left, he visited the tomb one last time. This time, he brought a chisel. A risk, yes, but he needed to see. He pried at the seal. And beneath it, nestled in the crack between stone and lid, he found a scrap of cloth, blue silk, embroidered faintly with the letter E. It was not Napoleon's uniform. The journey from Saint Helena to Cadiz took 7 weeks. Ellis traveled incognito, dressed as a merchant clerk under the name James Hartley. His resignation had been accepted quietly, with no questions asked, perhaps because his silence was assumed. But Ellis knew the truth was now in motion, and he was merely its unwilling courier. Spain was humid and pulsing with post-war tension. The Bourbon monarchy clung to power, and French influence remained thick in the ports. Cadiz, sprawling and sun-bleached, held layers of information buried beneath the cries of fishmongers and the echo of church bells. Ellis rented a modest room near the harbor and began his search at the customs house, claiming to be investigating lost cargo. The official, a man named Galvez, wore a naval ring and spoke with bureaucratic pride. Ellis requested logs from May and June of 1821. After hours of cross-checking, a pattern emerged. One vessel, La Silencieuse, had docked quietly, with no declared passengers and an unusual gap in documentation. It had arrived on the 18th of June, carrying sensitive French diplomatic cargo, according to a stamped annotation from Madrid. But buried deeper, in a ledger less sanitized, Ellis found an unlisted name attached to the manifest, Nicolas Emile. A pseudonym? The handwriting was different, hurried. He compared it to the letter from London. His instructor had enclosed samples of Napoleon's known penmanship. The N matched exactly. Nicolas Emile. Napoleon Bonaparte. Ellis's pulse thudded in his ears. He traced the name through other docks, no record, no sightings, just a ghost touching land, vanishing into Spain. He changed tactics. Instead of following Napoleon, he followed the money. Napoleon's family had scattered, but there were still loyalists, some in Italy, others in Corsica. He found mention of a transaction from a Cadiz banking house to a Florence account under the name Beauregard. The sum was vast. Ellis wired for funds and booked travel east. Florence was decadent and secretive, a city where politics whispered through marble hallways. The Beauregard account was closed, but the banker confirmed its owner had been a retired officer with a limp and a Corsican accent. Paid in gold, gone now. He followed a trail of receipts to a villa outside the city, surrounded by olive trees and silent walls. The locals referred to the previous tenant as Il General, who arrived late in 1821, accompanied by 2 French-speaking attendants. He had purchased maps of Eastern Europe, often rode at night, and never gave a surname. He died here? Ellis asked. No, said the villa's caretaker. He left one night, took nothing. Another disappearance. Another dead trail. Ellis paused. What if he wasn't meant to be followed? Back in Florence, he sat in a cafe overlooking the Arno, the wind warm with summer. He read again the final lines from the decoded letter his instructor had sent. The mirror is intact. The emperor walks among shadows, not to return but to erase. He no longer seeks thrones, only silence. It was a philosophy, not a plot. Napoleon had staged his own death not to regain power, but to surrender it without humiliation. His illness, real or not, had been the instrument. The body double, whoever he was, had died so that Napoleon could vanish, unchained by history. But even ghosts left trails. Ellis returned to London by autumn, his papers secured, his story impossible to publish. The press had canonized the exile's death. The tomb was official. Any deviation would brand him mad. He kept silent, for a time. Then, in 1823, he received a package. No return address, just a single item inside. A coin, an old French franc, scratched along its edge with 3 initials, NEB, Nicolas Emile Bonaparte? Or a final echo of a man who had once ruled Europe? Ellis closed the lid, locked the box, and placed it beside the original journal he had once hidden in a trunk on Saint Helena. There it remained, untouched, until the day he died. Years passed, decades, even. Lieutenant Jonathan Ellis faded from memory, buried quietly in a modest cemetery outside Norwich, his gravestone marked only with rank and service. No mention of Saint Helena. No hint of the emperor whose shadow had followed him to the grave. But the journal, his most dangerous possession, survived. It was found in 1871, during the cataloguing of an estate once owned by a descendant of Ellis's brother. The leather had cracked, and pages curled with time, but the ink remained legible. A young historian named Alfred Whitaker was assigned to assess its value. What he found was far more than expected. The journal detailed everything. The mysterious crate, the coded letters, the vanishing valet, the messages from Spain and Florence. Whitaker at first dismissed it as an elaborate fiction, until he compared the handwriting samples and began cross-referencing names. Montholon had returned to France, but his post-exile accounts were curiously inconsistent. Bertrand had died quietly, never publicly revisiting Napoleon's final days. Dr. Antomarchi had published memoirs, but with glaring omissions matching precisely the events Ellis described. Then there was Marchand. Official histories listed him as remaining in France until his death in 1876. But Whitaker uncovered an arrest record from Marseille in 1834, a man matching Marchand's exact description, detained under suspicion of espionage, gave a false name, Jean Dupuis, but left a signature on the release form. It matched Marchand's handwriting. Released and never seen again. Whitaker followed the threads like Ellis had, cautiously, secretly. He shared his findings only with a professor at Cambridge, who promptly advised him to destroy the journal or risk national disgrace. Instead, Whitaker buried it deeper. He published a series of fictionalized essays, never naming Napoleon, never stating the truth. But to those who knew where to look, the clues were unmistakable. One story, The Man Without a Death, referenced a figure who staged his own funeral, fled under the cover of political decay, and died peacefully in a foreign monastery as a gardener. The essays became cult curiosities. Among those who read between the lines was a French archivist named Lucien Vaudrin, who in 1905 reopened several sealed military logs from the Bourbon Restoration. She found records of secret payments issued to Émile N., beginning in 1822 and ending abruptly in 1840, the year Napoleon's remains were ceremonially transferred from Saint Helena to Paris in a grand procession. A grand procession, of whom? The coffin, once sealed, was never opened during the transfer. The ceremony was too important, too symbolic. And so it was that France brought home a corpse, perhaps of a double, and interred it beneath the dome of Les Invalides, while the real Napoleon, if Ellis was right, had long since died in obscurity. Vaudrin never published. Her notes ended with a single line. He died free, but not remembered. Perhaps that is how he wished it. In 1973, a controversial DNA study was quietly authorized by the French government. They sought to compare hair samples from Napoleon's known relics with the remains interred at Les Invalides. The results were inconclusive, publicly. Privately, the lead geneticist resigned without explanation and relocated to Canada. And still the rumors endured. In a small museum in Corsica, a visitor once asked the curator about a series of letters displayed in the back, unsigned and never authenticated, speaking of a grave behind a chapel in the hills of Tuscany. The curator simply smiled and said, "Many men wrote such things. Few had reason to lie. Fewer had reason to tell the truth." And so the question remained unanswered, resting not in textbooks but in whispers, passed from historian to archivist, from skeptic to believer. The question Ellis had first penned in the faded pages of a hidden journal beneath a soldier's trunk. Is the man in that coffin really Bonaparte? No one could answer. But somewhere, in the quiet hills of Italy, there is said to be an unmarked grave, beside a crumbling chapel, where blue silk once fluttered in the wind. And in it, perhaps, lies a man who once ruled an empire, and chose instead to disappear.